In theory, we are live, maybe. Waiting. Yeah, no, I've got it open too. There it is. Oh, God. Mute me. There we go. Let's hear myself. Are you? Can we make sure your audio is good?
Testing.
One more time, I'm sorry.
Testing.
Okay. It's like I was sort of filtering out myself, so then I filtered out you in that channel. Good. Okay. Hi. Happy Thanksgiving late, especially if you're not in the US. I'm sure that holiday means a bunch to you. Yeah, so this is the 2.5 thousand subscriber Q&A live stream because, oh my God, thank you guys. It's crazy. It's the same pin. My tech assistant / husband apparently doesn't know how to get into my work phone, which is helpful. And yeah, so I have some questions from Twitter. And if you guys have questions, all 4 of you, maybe. One might be me, one might be you. Whoever's here, feel free to ask questions, get to them as we can, although this isn't going to be a huge thing, I'm sure. So, yeah. It's just going to be a chill, blah, blah, blah. So, what are we starting with?
I want to start with this one. So,
who's asking it?
A. Khaled.
Okay.
So, how do you so elegantly thread the needle between aesthetic of academia, which is boring apparently, and your own bread tube style, which is colorful, inviting, and is in contrast much less intimidating?
Oh, hello. I should probably mute my phone or just hide it. Okay. So, something that I always got strong feedback on when I was adjuncting as a grad student was my teaching. So I think just in general, my style is pretty low-key, and so I'm not pretentious is the absolute most pretentious thing to say, but I think part of it is I tried to sort of model my teaching style on my favorite undergrad professor, who was amazing. Like, he looked like George Carlin, and just, we called his lectures like story time because you would go, it was really chill, and it was almost like a conversation. And the university we went to was really small, so the largest class I had with him was like 20 people. So, that made it a much more cozy space, but it was very chill, it was very relaxed. So I really enjoyed that and tried to sort of emulate that, and it was a good match for my personality, because I am kind of chill and low-key. And yeah, so then I think that, and one of my favorite comedians is Eddie Izzard, where just, I think it was Dressed to Kill. Eddie talks about just never scripting out the shows, just always rough guideline of things to talk about, and just seat of the pants, let's go. Whatever springs to mind is what springs to mind. And when I was adjuncting, that was absolutely sort of my style. My lecture notes were just bullet points of things I wanted to talk about, and I would talk about them. So low-key stuff from undergrad, and hi, Susanna. Sort of trying to incorporate just more of a free spirit and not have everything scripted in my adjuncting, and sort of trying to adapt that for YouTube has been interesting. My early videos, it was just an outline and I would ramble, and rambling in a lecture is more okay because it gives students time to write down the important thing. But rambling in a YouTube video is less good. And I'm probably going to be doing a fair amount of rambling today. So you'll see how off the leash I can go. So I've tried to get in the habit of scripting things and making sure I know exactly what I'm going to say so I don't end up just rambling on some tangent while the not students are not taking notes, because that's just not how YouTube works. So to get back to the question, to me, like, yeah, some academic lectures can just be boring as anything. And those are not good lectures, in my opinion. In my opinion, a lecture should be engaging and should be interesting and should keep you intergaged, kind of. I mean, it's not like YouTube, certainly, but there should still be something there to grab you. And yeah, so I think maybe my answer to this is maybe I was never really the driest of academics in my teaching style. Would that be fair? And the bread tube style, like, I wanted more interesting lighting than just the white lights that came with the lighting kit I bought. So I found like these little LED lights on Amazon that were really cheap that screwed in and I could do fun things with them. And it meshes with the bread tube style, but I wasn't setting out to try to do the bread tube style. It just sort of worked out that way, and using it as sort of a narrative cue for the different streams of thought with like the Peterson videos or for other things, where to break up like what sort of thing I'm talking about. Because in a lecture, for some reason, it's easier to sort of portray just I'm flipping voice into a demonstration, or I'm flipping my stance and the way I'm talking into something else. And so it's easier to get that across, I think. But I mean, certainly people like Philosophy Tube do that flipping in a very theatrical way. And it's be above my skill set, I think. So yeah, I guess I wouldn't say I do it elegantly. But yeah.
So, I don't know. I would add that
Can I hand that back?
I don't know how to open it. So I would add that you've always been sort of punny.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Even in lecture.
Yeah.
Using the latest meme type things.
Meme culture is doing me dirty.
Is it?
Yeah. Well, so when I was adjuncting, the average lifespan of a meme was more than a day. And now memes live and die in like a day. And so like I find one I think is funny. Like maybe in the editing I'll make you get a thing, because my husband likes to break these up into little digestible chunks. My favorite recent meme is like the Real Housewives of wherever, with the woman like, nah, and then the cat on the other side of the table like, nah. I love that meme to no end. I don't think it's quite a dead meme just yet, but it's probably on its last legs. But yeah, I would use memes in my lectures to just make it interesting. And I love puns. Yeah. Is there anything I'm missing on that?
I'm trying to think how many professors would you say you've had that had a terrible dry lecture style versus interesting, let's say.
I could probably break the professors I had into 3 groups. One were like the good professors, and my audio is still coming through, right? Okay. The good professors, where it was engaging and interesting, and like I never dreaded going to class or hated going to class. So 2 of my psych professors of the 3, and so there's the one I talked about who was my undergrad advisor, and then there was another one who did the fun classes. So I took psychobiology of sex, drugs and behavior, and a couple others from him. And he had a very different teaching style. It was much more like, here's an outline and we're going to talk about it. But just the way he talked about things was really interesting. And then like one of my biology professors, two of my biology professors, very different styles, but still very engaging and very interesting. And I don't know, I think part of what made their styles interesting is that it was more natural. It wasn't forced, it wasn't rehearsed, but they knew their stuff. So then the middle camp was the other psych professor, and I'm sure you know, yep, because he has a psych minor, so he took a fair amount of psych too, who typed out his entire lectures, like, and he would read it just word for word as a lecture, and it was so boring. So boring. But there was humor because he was using overhead slides, and he had, like, he would show up to class 10 minutes early and just lay out every single slide that he was going to show in class that day. And he had a system that always failed him. So he'd be looking for a particular slide demonstrating something, and the next 2 minutes would be him like, oh, where'd it go? Where'd it go? Where'd it go? Where'd it go? There it is. That's not it. Where'd it go? And it was painful, but it was funny. And then I think a fair amount of my grad professors would probably fall in this category. Like Richard of my grad school nightmare wanted everybody to lecture like him, but he had a very forced lecture style where you could tell that he practiced it a lot. Like he rehearsed it, so everything was practiced and everything was very staged and it felt artificial. Like forced enthusiasm, forced energy, forced stuff, and it made me cringe. And a couple other professors in my department did that too, where they practice, had this lecture well rehearsed so they could give it, but it just, because it was so rehearsed and so by the script, it wasn't engaging. It never grabbed me in the same way. Whereas some other psych professors in grad, like, they had sort of my style with like, okay, here's the lecture, you're going to fill in the blanks, and here we go. And it was much more engaging. And then, of course, there were just the outright bad lectures where it's like, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to sleep on the floor because how far into the stream are we? Censored word, this censored word. It was awful. And I hated it. I hated going to class. I would not go to class if I could. And just, it was awful because it was dry, and it was awful because they were abrasive in some cases. Like my chemistry professor, he wasn't a fun, good guy. Like he would brag about how low his teaching evaluations were. Like it was a point of pride for him. And yeah, so I think the difference for me is just how comfortable and how natural the lecture feels, and how much the lecturer seems to know the material and is comfortable talking about it and wants to be there. Certainly some professors I've had, they didn't want to be there, and you could tell. So,
I mean, I would only add that, I think what you tried to reinforce was your best lectures also made content interesting and engaging and approachable. Mm-hmm. And we've all had some of those and some of the opposite, which are terrible. Mm-hmm. I don't know. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out that all of academia is boring.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that question has been answered into the ground.
Sure. Well, we're showing time too, right? Do you want to talk about the soul?
Okay. So go ahead and read it.
So there was a question, Alba Skylar. So there's apparently a study that says people lose 6 grams or something like that when they die. Is that evidence of a soul, I guess, basically?
Okay. So I'd heard this before, and so it rang a bell, and I was able to find a reference to this, and it was actually 21 grams, not 6 grams. And it was a study published in 1907 by Duncan McDougall. And yes, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page. So it goes. Who was in Massachusetts. He hypothesized that the souls have a physical weight. And so you get a cadaver, or you get a person who's just died, weigh them, and you should see like a little release of some weight as they die, and that's their spirit leaving their body. And yeah, so in the publication, I guess there were 6 patients that he weighed when they died, and one of them lost 21 grams at some point in this death process. And from that, apparently, it was published that the soul has a weight of 21 grams. And I mean, it's something I heard probably on the History Channel when we were in high school in one of those like Bible, whatever TV shows. And yeah, so the fact that the guy measured corpses, or people who died, which then turned into corpses, and found a 21 gram difference in that death process, like that's noise. Like the conversion, so 28 grams is an ounce. There's 16 ounces, I believe, in a pound.
Can I do it like a physicist?
Do it like a physicist.
All right. So the average person weighs 100 kilograms, say, and he's measuring, say, 10 grams.
21.
Whatever. As a physicist, we do order of magnitude. So he's measuring a part per million almost of a change, which is negligible. I mean, in 19 whatever, I doubt you could actually do that.
Yeah. They certainly didn't have digital scales back then.
Wow.
So
your average digital scale can't do it, even today.
Mine can weigh 20 grams.
Yeah, but it can't weigh 100 kilograms, the difference in 20 grams.
Fair. Yeah. So, I mean, the research is suspect. The Wikipedia mentioned him maybe piloting. I didn't read super deep, but piloting with like dogs, and so having to kill the dogs to see like, can I get a difference in weight? But then, maybe dogs don't have souls, so do it on humans. So it's very suspect, and to me it's in the noise. Yeah.
Okay. What I think you should do now is give your argument against the soul. You've given it before, but you can repeat it.
The video one? The like why I'm an atheist one?
Basically.
Okay. So the thing my husband is alluding to is some people come into atheism through a religious path. So they were raised religious, either like the hypocrisy, I can speak, of the church, or bad things that happen to them in the church, or just getting exposure to different beliefs. Hey, Meta. And yeah, so some people, their path to atheism is through religion and then kind of exposure to different ideas. And that definitely wasn't my path. I was raised Lutheran, technically, but we went on holidays, if that. I was sick on Easter and then sick on Christmas. And so we just kind of stopped going after that. And I was perfectly happy because I didn't like going. So not the strictest religious upbringing. And I was still spiritual. I like this idea of my consciousness living on after I died and not being dead, just not stopping existing. That's still something I'm not comfortable with. But the quote that sort of kept me invested for a long time was something about like some religious person and an atheist talking, and basically the atheist asks something about like, okay, so how are all these different religions talking about the same God potentially? And the religious person says something about like, imagine all of the people in the world's, or people representing the world's religions are standing in a ballroom, and there is a chandelier at the center of the ballroom. Everybody has a different perspective on that chandelier, but they're all seeing the same chandelier. And so that's sort of like an explanation for how like the Hindu, Christians, Norse, like all of these different groups over time have different understandings of this cosmic being that's responsible for stuff. And then, you know, the atheist or the agnostic are the ones who choose to look away. So that lasted me for a while. And even in undergrad, I was still sort of vaguely spiritual. But in grad school, sort of sitting down and thinking about all these experiments that I'd learned all the way from intro and really thinking about them and thinking about like my dad who died and basically was probably brain dead the first day he went into the hospital and then was on life support for like a week and a half after that. The realization that if he came out of that coma, he wouldn't have been the same person. Like his brain would have been horribly damaged because he was without oxygen for something like 20 minutes. He wouldn't have been my dad. And how do I cope with that? And also, the big example is like Phineas Gage, which we talk about in intro psych, railway worker, accident, he gets a metal rod through his brain and through the frontal lobe. And his personality changed after the accident. And this also happens sometimes for people who have strokes or aneurysms, where just part of like the frontal lobe is damaged and their personality changes. And so the thing I couldn't rectify is, okay, let's say I'm me. That's an easy example. I try to be a good person. I try to be considerate. I try to be kind and empathetic and all of these things. If I'm in a very bad car accident and my frontal lobe just bites it, there's a good chance that I wouldn't be a lot of these things. I might be more cruel. I might be more heartless towards other people. Like a lot of these things that are sort of core me would change. And the issue that ended up sort of breaking it for me is what does that mean for the soul, especially in like a Christian sense, where you live a good life, you go to heaven, you live a mean, bad life, you go to hell. So the person had been good for most of their life, doing the good, godly things, and then freak accident happens, and now they're just a mean curmudgeon of a person. Where does their soul go when they die? Does it go to heaven because most of their life was good and it's not their fault that their brain got messed up? Or do they go to hell because, you know, the end of their life is full of that mean, awful behavior? And for a little bit, it was like, okay, maybe like the soul isn't necessarily tied to a person's personality. So there was a good soul, and then in the accident that went on, and then you get a bad soul, but then it's like, what am I even doing? There's a lot of not parsimonious hoop jumping going on here to try to make this work. So I ended up settling on a very materialist, monist perspective where, you know, our consciousness is part of our brain, and maybe there's some weird epiphenomenon thing that is giving rise to consciousness, but it's part of the brain. You need the brain to have consciousness. No brain, no consciousness. And because of that, no soul. Was that the rambly, not edited version of that story? So yeah, that's how I would say it is.
So I'll ask Skylar again. If you wanted to study cognitive psychology, what would be a good book to start with? And I guess it depends on what you mean by to study.
Yeah. So I actually grab this so I wouldn't be pulling it out from behind me. So I know this author gets a fair amount of hate recently for some of the books he's published, but I stand by his older work certainly, and I'm going to read his newer stuff and see like what the drama is, because I honestly don't know. So, Steven Pinker, How the Mind Works. This, I think, is a reasonable entry point into something like cognitive psychology. Again, it's Steven Pinker, How the Mind Works. It is not a new book by any stretch of the imagination. Try and look at published. Back says 99. I can't believe it's that old. Oh, yeah, it's that old. So, old entry point, but a good entry point because I think it tackles a lot of the foundational assumptions and ways that cognitive psychologists try to tackle problems. So I think it's a good entry point. It's doing something that Peterson can't quite manage doing in 12 Rules, where it's written for a general audience but incorporates research and isn't afraid to talk about the experiments and things in a way that trusts the reader to be able to understand. And I mean, it definitely made sense to me because it's my field. But I think for somebody who's not familiar with cognitive psychology, I think it's still a reasonable entry point. And trying to think of a different thing to say that wouldn't just be repeating myself. Because that's what I would do in lectures, repeat myself in a different way so people have time to write. Yeah. So it's basically how your mind works. And something that I'll talk about a little bit in the psychiatry video that's coming next week is sort of the differences between the different sort of boxes of psychology. And in cognitive psychology, especially, we're interested in the stuff that's going on in the cognitive black box. So this behaviorism, US behaviorism didn't really take off elsewhere. It made it to Canada, but didn't really import well into Europe and things. So behaviorists were studying animal models, looking at stimulus response. Animal pushes a lever, gets a thing out. This is what we're interested in. And they tried to scale it up for human behavior with some success. One of the big guys, Watson, actually went into advertising and was one of the first sort of madmen almost with, we set up this stimulus and we get the response of people buying our stuff. So on some level, it does work, but the cognitive revolution, and at some point I will make a video on that because it's sexy and it's where cognitive came from. Part of it was just behaviorism can't account for a lot of things going on. And what's going on inside this black box between the stimulus and the response is important. And we should try to figure out what processes are happening in there. And just because we can't directly measure them with like a ruler or something, it doesn't mean that we can't measure them. And so a lot of cognitive psychology is built up on this assumption or assumptions of basically like certain mental processes take a certain amount of time. And so if something is taking more time, that means it might be harder. They're having to go further in their neural representations of things, tons of different assumptions that I think are reasonable assumptions for how the cognition works. So yeah, I think that was an answer.
It was certainly a book recommendation.
It was definitely a book recommendation.
All right. So this is a question about consciousness. So you probably know which one it is. I'm trying to phrase it. So nobody knows how consciousness works anyway. So let's start with the question more specifically. Could consciousness come from our evolution, say from neuroticism as a trait of keeping ourselves safe, or maybe empathy, seeing things from other people's point of view?
Situ?
Ish.
So yeah. So I think depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer. And I'll get to Meta's question in a second. I just saw it. So I am on the side that animals, like higher animals, like cats, dogs, dolphins, octopuses, chimps, like I'm trying to think like more towards the boundary. Cuttlefish, which are close to octopuses, um, let's say sailfish, sharks, lots of different animals have some form of conscious experience. Somebody like Richard, my advisor, I think was more on the side that they don't. But, and I think that because I don't know, it sort of depends on how you define conscious experience. So to me, the thing that sticks out, and this is just anecdata, is that every cat I've known has had a very distinct personality that's consistent over time. And so those differences in personality means that they interact with the environment differently, but also that they have sort of a persistent way that they go through the world and interact with the world and expect the world to interact back with them. And that kind of to me indicates that they sort of have a sense of who they are as little furry or scaly creatures, and they have some form of memory because they do remember bad things happening to them and try to avoid doing the things that lead to the bad things, assuming the feedback is done in a good way. So that stuff kind of suggests to me that they do have some form of conscious experience. It may not be quite what we experience, but they still have a conscious experience for the world to me. So to get more at the question, I think probably something like the mirror neurons in the brain which fire when we see other people or even like other us-ish organisms do stuff sort of as a reflection of what they're doing. So these are typically like motor neurons that'll fire when watching somebody try to fix something or whatever. And it's thought that this is a way to sort of save on learning. So instead of having to do it yourself to learn, you can just watch somebody else and get that mirror neuron engagement, get a rough approximation for what needs to be done, and then actually do it yourself. So I know part of the argument is that mirror neurons are what sort of underlie some of empathy, because if you can see somebody doing something and hurt themselves, you kind of feel bad too. And from that, you can kind of build up to like you see somebody hurting in some way, just like emotional pain, and that triggers like a mirrored response almost. And so you can do sort of tending and mending behaviors to try to improve their situation. And then that gets into the social networks of us being very little social creatures. So I could see empathy in being able to understand other people feel things like you do, sort of a theory of mind sort of thing, would help in consciousness. I'm not sure if it would come before consciousness or after. And I think, what was it, the neuroticism of staying alive in the question? Sort of.
Yeah, neuroticism is a, yeah.
I mean, so I think the bottom line is that organisms who have a conscious experience of the world have a survival advantage over those who don't. So I could see it being selected for long, long ago, where just if you have a memory of where you've been, what's happened to you, what little or environments or organisms to avoid and which ones are safe. Having a sense of you in the environment and your interactions with the environment. I could see that organism surviving better than one that just flying by the seat of their pants. Stimulus response. That burned, don't do that, but not really having a longer term representation of that. And so going back and getting burned again and again, or almost getting eaten, and then getting eaten. So I could see it being selected for. So I think consciousness and conscious experience is probably relatively old, not like crazy old in the grand scheme of things, but certainly not just humans or human-like organisms that all died off.
You want to do metas?
Oh.
And then I have one more.
Okay. So Metamorphosis asked that they were just talking to someone today about my interest in possible connections between religious experience and spirituality. Any plans for more related research study videos? Yes. So let's see. I've got psychiatry coming up next week. The week after that, I will be talking about Michael Persinger's God helmet, that experiment, what led into it, follow-up work on it. And that was basically like a thing you put on and would induce the experience of God in people who wore it. So certainly interesting because it is a religious experience in people who may not be religious themselves, and the implications of that and stuff. Yeah, so talk about that. What was the one? On one of the comments for one of the videos, because the YouTube interface for responding to comments is just an absolute mess, Adam Apple actually linked a book I think might be this thing that I thought I might be making up about like the God area in the brain. So need to hunt down that book, need to hunt down some papers. But pending reading that, I do want to talk about that because that's interesting that like maybe we have this region in the brain that when activated in the right way, boom, religious experience. And it'd be interesting if my memory is correct that some people who tend to be more on the atheist side of things just don't get this activation. So we'll see if that's in there and if that's an argument that's borne out. Certainly, and something else that ties into this is DMT. The drug DMT that Joe Rogan will talk anybody's ear off about, because it does seem to give people religious experiences. Like LSD can kind of connect people to the universe and their place in it, but DMT just seems to just touch like this magical little place in people's brain and just change their perspective. And it kind of scares me, honestly. Like it just, as an outsider who's never used it and has never used a hallucinogen because, oh my God, I don't want to mess with my bipolar, that a substance could just so fundamentally change your entire worldview scares me. It scares me. But definitely want to explore that at some point down the road. So, yes, definitely have more plans for that.
So I got a question from Twitter just a few minutes ago.
Ooh.
By Mo. I think the gist of it is assuming we have cognitive limits because we're humans and there's a limit to our cognitive
like
abilities.
Bottlenecks and stuff?
No.
No.
Maybe we can never understand cognition because of these limits. Does that sound reasonable, plausible?
Yeah. So I think it's sort of like a philosophical argument I've seen around where like, oh God, how does this go? And maybe you remember, excuse me, that like, it's almost like set theory in math where in describing a set, it can't describe itself or something. Is that right? Like some weird thing?
No. I'm not familiar with the set theory idea, but
Yeah.
there's certainly theories like the multi-universe theory that.
Well, no, this was just me. You were reading, so you weren't listening. So I think the idea behind that question is, we are fleshy, constrained things. Can we ever fully understand and study ourselves in a way that, like, we can study other organisms because we are not them and we have sort of an advantage over them? And it's an interesting question. I'd like to think that we could potentially get to a point where we can explain like our consciousness. But yeah, I mean, going back to the horribly late patron live stream, clips of which are available on this channel, talking about Elon Musk and his push for basically combining humanity with AI. If that is the way we end up going, I think that would probably give that like step up and be able to look back at humanity and look in a more objective way that's not constrained by the fleshy bits between our ears. So I'd like to think we're clever enough to be able to figure out ourselves at some point. I mean, if we can figure out subatomic particles without being able to see them just looking at measurements, I'd like to think we can figure out ourselves, and our consciousness and how we work and things.
Is there any limit to our cognitive abilities in your mind? Like,
Absolutely.
well, could you expand on what we're limited to conceptualize in our cognition?
Well, so the limit that is just jumping to mind because of my research background. Hi, Mr. Placey. I'll get you in a sec. So the limit that I am absolutely the most familiar with is attention. My opinion, the best explanation or analogy for attention is it's like a swimming pool. You have this quantity of attention at any given point in time, and you can devote all of the attention to something, and so all those resources, all that pool water is going to this one task. Or you can sort of divvy up the attention to different tasks. So like when you're driving, some of it is going to the driving task, and there's many subtasks involved in driving. Some of them are more automatic, like where the pedals are, how hard you need to push. Lane keeping is relatively automatic. A lot of it you've just learned how to do. Automatic processes require less attention, so that's cool. Other things, like if you're in rush hour traffic, are controlled. So you need much more attention to be able to pay attention to the 20 million cars around you, some going like 100, some going 50 miles per hour, because this is California. That requires a lot of attention. And so if you then bring in a phone call and try to have a very deep, engaging conversation with somebody on the phone, you're running the risk of pushing some of those attentional resources off onto other things that aren't the driving task. And when you're distracted, you're more likely to have an accident. So, yeah.
So now that you've nicely hit that attention hammer or that attention nail with your attention hammer, is there any limit to what we can understand based on our limited cognitive abilities? That's when,
Right.
there's lots of things like our memory
Right.
that are limited, but not necessarily our ability to understand something like particle physics. Are there any limits to our understanding ability?
If there are, I don't think we've hit them yet. I mean, we're crafty little creatures, and I think we're really good at figuring out ways to get beyond what is immediately perceptible. So, like the X-ray background of the universe or whatever, like How? 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 Why? What? Like the math involved and the technology and all of it is just incredible and mind-blowing, and that's as far back as we can see in time, and that is just cool as fuck. I think we're far enough in that I can curse now. So I think that we can be crafty and creative and get the technology to figure out what's going on with our cognition. I'd like to think so. I'm an optimist in that way, I guess. Um, we have ways at getting around perceptual limits, certainly. Um, we have ways of getting around size issues, sort of like the fMRI, looking at differences in blood flow, and then several assumptions later, looking at differences in cognitive processes that happen during memory or attention or emotions. So I think we're creative and crafty enough to be able to get a good handle on ourselves, but it might be at some point we just reach a limit of this is the most that we can understand about ourselves, and beyond that we're going to need to tap on AI, or we're going to need to do something that's just not even thought of yet to really be able to understand ourselves. And then you get into kind of Lovecraft territory where can we understand that information at all? If it is something that's inaccessible to us, could we even make sense of whatever comes back? I'd like to think so, but we'll see. We'll see if it happens in our lifetime. If there is a world left to have after that. Okay. So, Mr. Placey would like to know, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, if there's any books on bipolar that I would recommend. So the go-to book for that is, I think it's called An Unquiet Mind or something. I think that's what it's called. If only I had a way to look it up. Yes. Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jameson. It's basically her autobiography of going into psychology from a relatively privileged background. I do have to say it was kind of annoying at some parts hearing about like she had financial problems because in a manic phase she overspent and her boyfriend was able to just pay her bill off. Like, what? Crazy. So I think it really is a good description of how the disorder can impact the way you think and the way you go about things. And also with a fair amount of insight coming from the training that she had received over her post-grad. So yeah, Unquiet Mind would be a good place to start. Something else that's not a book, but is near and dear to my heart because Stephen Fry is the best. It's been on YouTube. It might get pulled down, but then it gets thrown back up again. He did, I think it's a 2-part BBC little mini series called The Secret Life of the Manic Depressive. And in that, he goes around, talks about his own experiences with bipolar, interviews some celebrities like Carrie Fisher, as well as just regular people who have bipolar, how it's impacted their life, what they've done to accommodate it, what treatments work, and just sort of general experiences that people have had. So those 2 things, I think, would be my top recommendations. Ooh, meta's being meta. How would we know if it's beyond our possible comprehension? So I think, and maybe my physicist can talk about this a little bit further with quantum mechanics. I think if we get an answer back from, let's say, like UNIVAC or whatever AI thing is set to figure out our consciousness and our cognition, if we get an answer back and like, what does this even mean? Run it again. This doesn't make sense. Get an answer back. Still doesn't make sense. Independent lab has their own master AI thing with their own code solving the same problem. Get a similar answer. Like, okay, we're getting similar answers that we can't make sense of. Either the premise going into the programming that the AI is built on is flawed and it's just leading to bad answers, or welcome to the singularity. Life is never going to be the same. Things are going to change drastically as we accommodate this new stuff, as we try to figure out what it means. So I think that would kind of be a tell that it's beyond our comprehension. But I mean, how did particle physics kick off, since that's just an absolute mindfuck?
Oh boy. The physics is all very simple and it makes predictions. So I don't know how I can add to that necessarily. The same with cosmology. Like the physics is all fairly simple. It's just novel ways to apply it led to interesting revelation.
Well, I think the thing that I'm trying to get out of you is like quantum mechanics. If you haven't had the distinct pleasure of trying to understand, it's not nice and quantized like big things are. So it's like, there is one of me. I am sitting here. I'm not just going to sort of superposition or something myself across the room, be in both places, and then like both blink out of existence or something. Like probabilistic stuff doesn't really happen at the person scale.
Okay.
And trying to understand like the Schrodinger stuff, and that's not even that deep in.
Right. I don't know. I still don't know what to add to that conversation.
How do people make sense of quantum mechanics?
They don't. They just follow the math. So here's my analogy. Maybe we have language. Language, we can express many things.
Allegedly.
Math is not unlike language. In fact, it is a language. And I don't know that there is a limit to what we can understand, as long as, hi Cleo, what we can understand, as long as our language can describe the thing. And right now, the math can describe quantum mechanics, can describe more. You can describe 13 dimensions if you want. So we may not intuitively understand it. We may not be able to perceive it in our minds in some sort of reasonable way, but it doesn't mean that we can't describe it and
so
understand.
Maybe that's it.
We don't necessarily have the tools to understand particle physics in our head, right? We didn't evolve with quantum mechanical things happening to us, and we just don't have those tools in our head.
The package is not installed.
Yeah, but we have language, and then we have, other ways to communicate now. And to me, there seems to be no limit to what we can describe with language, math, or
yeah. So maybe that's our saving grace, is be able to put it in terms that make sense to us, and we can sort of wrap our heads around. Maybe not intuitively grok, but at least mostly understand and work with. So, yeah. Let's do.
There's nothing else on Twitter.
Nothing else on Twitter. Let's see, let me check Discord. This is how I look when I'm working on the computer. That's not Discord. Where is Discord? There it is. That's not a question. I mean, I guess I could ask or answer. Mask on Discord is basically enjoyed my history of psychology videos, the little baby videos that I upload when I need a week off. And they would be interested in talking about education from the perspective of cognitive psychologists. And Yes, actual context. You are late. Sorry. Um, I yeah, my husband likes putting together clip shows, so give him a day or two, and there will be bite-sized versions of the answers. Although I have been exceptionally rambly today, so maybe not bite-sized. Um, so yeah, I think cognitive psychology is one of the branches of psychology that make the easiest transition into talking about education. Feel free to ask questions here. Um, yeah, so cognitive psychology, because we are interested in like attention, memory, learning, perception, blah, 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 blah. Those mesh incredibly nicely onto a lot of educational concerns. How do we get students to pay attention better? How do we present information in a way that sticks? And certainly, I can tap a friend who is much more engrossed in the education and cognitive aspect and tap her for resources. But yeah, that is something I could certainly go into, especially if there's interest. So, yeah. What questions would I have? um, where's everybody roughly checking in from? Because I know just in looking at the analytics, I have a fair number of people not stateside. So it's interesting where everybody's coming from. Because, like, recently got to meet Oregon. Never been to Oregon. Husband has. I haven't. I hear it's lovely. Ooh, Canada. Minnesota. Also very cold. Pass. Been there, done that. Never again. Um, is it cold up for you guys? Like, depending on the part of Canada, it might not be ungodly awful. Okay, it's ungodly awful, yeah. Ooh, UK. It's kind of sad this year. Like, I think we've been mostly in the 50s Fahrenheit. Yes, freedom units. Sorry. Um, and I've just been so cold. So cold. Whereas, like, the place my husband did his postdoc, it would be like negative 20 out all winter. Again, freedom units, but approaching Celsius. And, like, we dealt with it. It probably helped that our building paid for heat, basically, because there were a lot of old people in the building, so it was always in the 70s at least inside, if not in the 80s. So I think that made it livable, but oh, I never want to do that cold again. Yeah, I know. It's California. It's California. It does something to you. It lulls you into this sense of security with, like, oh, the summer it might get up to like 90, but we'll be like in the 80s. And then, oh, it's fall. It's in the 70s. Oh, the trees are turning. And then it turns this 50 on us in rain. And, like, what is this cold water? I don't understand. Emotional intelligence. Okay, so actual context asked, how much would I say emotional intelligence plays into our political leanings? I'd imagine a fair bit. I also imagine there is research on this. I did the naughty in the last video and cited a book I didn't read. I think it was called Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, like talking about why Americans vote the way they do based on where they are. So I'm assuming it got into socioeconomic status, which is like your education level, your income level, where you are. It's this multifaceted representation of kind of your place in society. So high SES people have the high income, live in the nice houses, drive the nice cars, don't have to sweat when their car breaks. Lower SES individuals tend to have a lower education level, lower income, earnings do absolutely have to sweat when something breaks, even if it's like something that would cost a couple $100s to fix. That is a huge deal for somebody who is low SES. So I imagine, and this is speculation land, I imagine that people who have higher emotional intelligence would probably be more interested in helping other people, which tends to be a lefty political trait in the US for sure. So somebody with lower emotional intelligence, I imagine, would be less able to really put themselves in another's perspective and think about like the single mom who's working 2 jobs trying to support her family and how much it would benefit her to have better safe nets, safety nets for like her kids, programs after school so she can keep working, or the ability for her to have some sort of universal paycheck to help with things. So maybe she'd only have to work 1 job instead of 2. And those are very much more lefty things. And I think wanting to support those programs, even though they cost the individual more, especially if they're not in that lower SES group, I imagine that would be more associated with a higher emotional intelligence supporting those programs. So I have not read The Righteous Mind.
Can I throw a wrench?
No. No wrench.
No wrench? In academia, I notice a lot of significantly left-leaning people with very little emotional intelligence, but a lot of traditional intelligence, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
How does that? I mean, these are way outside the norm, right? These are, I mean, I deal with typically PhD physicists, but what would you say about their low emotional intelligence yet extremely left?
I'm trying to think who you're talking about.
Like everyone I work with.
Not all of them, no. You think they have low emotional intelligence?
I mean, a lot of them are. Well, maybe you need to define emotional intelligence.
So, and I may be corrected, but emotional intelligence is sort of, let me not be wrong and do the thing I yell at other YouTubers for and just Google it instead of talking out of my ass. Okay. Emotional intelligence is the capacity to be aware of, control, and express one's emotions and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of them are low.
What, just too blunt? Or?
No, I mean, feisty when there's no need for it, emotional when there's no need for it.
Okay. So, yeah, maybe the emotional intelligence construct, the thing that we're saying is emotional intelligence, there's multiple facets of it. So maybe your colleagues who can be a bit emotionally to work with, right? Still have an ability to empathize with others, and maybe like as a group, like the working class moms and dads, the single parents, and do things to benefit them. Maybe. Shrug.
I don't know.
Okay. So answer that. Captain Fitz battle axe. Yeah, Peterson, I mean, yeah, he goes with the big 5 a lot. I mean, the big 5 personality scale, not assuming you all understand or know, been exposed. So the big 5 are supposedly these personality traits. It's a model of personality, sort of like Freud and Jung had models of personality. The Big Five is another one that has been more replicatable and testable and falsifiable, so it's more solid. So the traits, the 5 personality traits that fall out of this stuff are openness, conscientiousness, empathy, something that stands with A, and neuroticism. I'm clearly a personality psychologist. Altruism? You wouldn't know. But yeah, so there's these 5 personality dimensions. So somebody can be high on openness, high on neuroticism, low on conscientiousness, although that would be a weird mix. And so it's basically 5 dimensions of personality, with you being somewhere on these axes as a reflection of your personality. And yeah, Jordan B. Peterson loves him, the Big Five. And I wouldn't be surprised, yeah, if he talks about personality traits, especially neuroticism. He loves him, that neuroticism, when talking about like political stuff instead of socioeconomic stuff. Whereas I think the socioeconomic stuff is really important to talk about because it can inform a lot of decisions that people make, because if you don't have money, that's kind of a primary concern. Yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah, Meta is saying that maybe there's a difference between emotional intelligence and social awkwardness. Is it socially awkward, or is it like you're dealing with the emotional intelligence equivalent of a kindergartner?
I would say some of both.
Agreeableness. Thank you. Yes, agreeableness. That's the A. My ocean mnemonic failed me. Oh, it's good.
Come over for gay sex.
Is your mic on? Okay, it's not. So I'm just laughing at you for no reason. Yeah, mnemonics are fun. So the one that I used for the Big Five is ocean, and filled in the blanks for what they were and spaced on agreeableness. At some point, I know we talked mnemonics in some video. Oh, this is probably how this study, where my favorite mnemonic, I got it from Comedy Central when I was in high school, and it served me well in biology. It's like, Kevin, please come over for gay sex. And so it's kingdom, phylum, please come. No. Shit. Kingdom, phylum, please come. Class, order, family, genus, species. So that's the biological organization, the phylum thingy. I remember it. That was 20 years ago. Yeah, so mnemonics are fun when they work. Yeah. Actual context, I agree that there's just, yeah, there's neurotics who are poor and there's neurotics who are rich. And there's tons of factors going into where we are in the grand hierarchy of life. Not everybody can be a top lobster. Womp womp. Okay. And my phone hasn't blown up any, so I don't think there's new tweets. And thank you, Liam, for the compliment. Or you're complimenting. I just, nope, not my compliment. Never mind. Thank you for being here. My attention is very thoroughly divided, so I apologize. Any last minute questions? Let's see, it's cold in some places and cold where we are. I think it's still raining right now. Let's see. So yeah, psychiatry video next week. God helmet video after that. And then probably get into the next Peterson chapter. The next Peterson chapter is going to be a nightmare. I read it in airports and on the plane. And it is Rule 7. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. And this is a long chapter, like 40 pages. The last chapter with my joke of like, oh, this will be easy, was like 15 pages, and it took me 3 videos.
Well, hopefully he won't cite
this
school
one's
shooters.
bad. This one, he's not citing school shooters.
Hit your microphone somewhere.
Okay. There's a lot of outtakes of me just smacking the shit out of the microphone. Sorry. Yeah. Let's see. There's a lot more comments on this with like, what, more fairy tales, what, fuck off, cake. For someone who doesn't exist, he sure is demanding. Yeah, it's gonna be a bad chapter. Like, and this came up in the Patreon live stream, but I'll show it here because I think it's funny. So because I was reading Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life in Public, I didn't want to be seen reading Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life in Public. So had a nice little camouflage book cover like you do in middle school with the books. So I was seen reading this because no, I'm not being seen reading this thing in public. Yep, that's my job. Oh, while waiting for last minute questions to filter in, I signed up for the beta for Jordan B. Peterson's personal social media website. It is more shameful than porn in public. You are quite right, Captain Fixer. So Jordan B. Peterson is going to try to launch his own personal Reddit, Twitter, something social media platform. And it's going to be pay to get in when it's live. I'm not sure if the beta is going to be paid. And the selling point of it is that it will be censorship free. No post will be removed unless demanded by federal law. I want to see the garbage fire that's going to be going on in there. I mean, like there's talk on BreadTube about like, do we storm the fences and just start posting Marxist ideologies there and see if it gets censored? But then you're giving Peterson money. So I'm tempted, since I've made like half my YouTube channel Peterson, just seeing what the cost is and seeing what goes on. Maybe. We'll see. I've managed to avoid buying Maps of Meaning, which is a win in my book. So we'll see. We'll see if I get an invite or if they like do a cursory internet check for who people are who are asking to join the beta. Cass Harris does videos on Peterson. Has lobster in the title on occasion. Nihilism snake.
Well.
Yeah. All right. So I think that is probably it for the 2.5 thousand subscribers. My God. Oh, so many months ago when I was just starting with my like 3 subscribers and looking at Social Blade because I like torturing myself, and it does projections of when you'll reach milestones, and it's like, oh, maybe I'll have 1,000 in 3 years. Yeah. Much love to Curio. His channel, I got a huge bump, like twice the size almost, from a recommendation from Curio. So always much love there. And also Apologia, who I can say right when I'm thinking about it. Shannon Q and other people who've given me little bumps over this year. It all has been appreciated and welcomed, and you guys are awesome. Yeah. Well, I mean, the Social Blade, I'm happy. Like, I went from like an F to a D to like C to B range. So it's not terribly self-harmy for me, but I'm super not like looking at like the day by day change in subscribers, then it probably would have branched more into self-harm for me. And that is something I do have to be mindful of because I do have those tendencies. So yeah, it's just like a quick glance, look at projection for when the next thing is happening, and then that's it. So thank you, Captain Fitz Battleaxe. All right, so I think it's about dinner time here. That's probably a good time to end it. So thank you all for tuning in and asking questions and being awesome. And new video Friday. If there's interest, can do more of these. Yeah, there's also Patreon. Those get a monthly live stream for sure. Which won't be late this next time because at the very least I'll be using this and stop trying to do the fancy stuff with OBS. I'm tired of being late. Okay. Anyways, on that note, have a good weekend and see you guys kind of Friday.